it fits into the president's light footprint strategy, which is an effort to have a way to deal with adversaries without sending in 100,000 troops, without occupying a country, without having to bomb Iran, without having to invade other countries, without spending $1 trillion.
David,
that's where sort of drones and cyber and special forces all meet.
Right. But we've been using drones for longer, I think, than we have these cyber programs. And
a bit longer. We've been using drones basically since 2001, 2002. And the cyber program, I put its roots in, its sort of start in 2006, 2007.
Right. Thank you for that. And thousands of drone attacks, of course, and we don't really know exactly how many cyber attacks. But I want to say, with a more conventional war, you talked about light footprint. We know, or we think we know what's coming. You couldn't escape it. We've seen it on TV, listened to it on NPR. But with this sort of attack, it's a fairly small group. I mean, we're talking about war by other means, incrementalism. Doesn't that raise the risk that a very small group, successful with bin Laden, but that a small group could conjure enormous consequences without much national discussion?
That's right. And, people have asked, why did the New York Times write about this? Why am I writing about this in the book? Well, because there are a lot of classified programs that we've had over the years, nuclear weapons, predators, intercontinental missiles, where the program itself and its details can be classified, but there still needs to be a national debate about how you use that weapon. I mean, remember when nuclear weapons came out, it took 20 years before we sort of came to the conclusion that these are too powerful to use. MacArthur wanted to use them in Korea. There were some in the Air Force who argued to President Kennedy, that he needed to use them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Eventually, we came to an understanding of how we use them as a deterrent and sort of a weapon of last resort. With drones, it's taken nearly a decade to work out some rules about when and where and how we deploy them and use them, and we're still arguing over those rules and whether this is more like targeted assassination or not. Sooner or later, as a country, we're going to have that same debate about cyber weapons.
Well, and whether or not targeted assassination is an act of war.
Targeted assassination in the case of drones. I mean, you don't target an assassination with cyber. But certainly whether a cyber invasion of another country is an act of war. Now, some people have pointed out since the excerpt appeared in the Times last Friday and since the book has come out that if you go back to the Pentagon's own description of cyber defense, it is said that a cyber attack on the infrastructure of the United States could well be interpreted as an act of war. That's if it's incoming. Mm-hmm. So then the question comes, well, if that's the case, what do we want to think about our own use of offensive cyber weapons? Yes,
because we maybe did not get into the details of what exactly happened in Natanz. I mean, we don't know. Assassination may not be the word, but we don't know if bodies dropped. We do know that since this program began with the Bush administration, that presidents were shown models of melted down centrifuges. Not models, the actual
blown
thing.
Apart models. Yes,
yeah.
The U.S. I think what you're referring to, Jackie, is I describe in the book how the United States had to test out the cyber weapon just like you test any other weapon.
This is fascinating.
Right, and so they built basically a virtual model of the Natanz plant in some of the national laboratories, including the Idaho National Laboratory and elsewhere. They spread it out over several laboratories so people wouldn't sort of put it together that the target here was Iran.
And they got that from A.Q. Khan.
They got the centrifuges from A.Q. Khan. I mean, we had a little gift from the Libyans. You may remember that in 2003, Gaddafi decided to give up his nuclear weapons program, which hadn't gone very far. But what he had done was bought some centrifuges from A.Q. Khan. I've been down to the laboratory in Tennessee and seen some of what they had. Mm-hmm. And these are the same kind of centrifuges that A.Q. Khan sold to the Iranians. So we had some models of what the Iranians had. And those were, let's say, borrowed from the Tennessee lab for what is euphemistically called destructive testing. And what happened was they set up this model and they attacked it with the cyber attack. It blew apart. And some of the rubble from that was flown to Washington and dropped on the conference room table inside the Situation Room for President Bush to look at. And it was at that moment that he sort of approved going ahead and trying this in Iran.
So how much control and precision does that give presidents when it comes to picking targets? You also write that President Obama, who campaigned on transparency in acts of war, gradually became more and more sophisticated in terms of looking at this horse blanket that you described, these maps, and by all telling, sort of helped to pick, or at least was present when targets were chosen.
He certainly, I don't think he picked individual centrifuges, but he certainly approved bolder and bolder operations. And it was that escalation of operations in 2010 that ultimately ended up with that escape of the worm that we described before. So, there's always a risk level as you increase the boldness of these attacks that something's going to go wrong, and eventually something did. Now, what's interesting is that even after it did go wrong, he came to the conclusion that the Iranians probably still hadn't figured out fully what was going on, and he approved some additional attacks. And it was one of those additional attacks shortly after the Stuxnet worm got out that brought down a little under 1,000 of the centrifuges.
All right, we're getting a lot of calls for you, David Sanger. So let's go to the phone, 1-800-423-8255. Tony is calling from Exeter, New Hampshire. Welcome to On Point, Tony.
Thank you. Hi, Jackie.
Hi.
I have a degree in information technology, and I also have security training through the System Administration and Networking Security Institute. And about 10 years ago, I wrote my dissertation to get that certification through SANS Institute, specifically on this topic of recognizing that more and more infrastructure was being connected to the Internet for remote control access, and that there were not enough security aspects or controls to protect them. And then I recognized that in the years to come, there was going to be exactly this kind of thing happening. And, things such as the reason being that I recognize that we need to keep our infrastructure such as nuclear power plants, electrical power plants, access to control of dams and railroad tracks, and anything you can think of needs to be protected in that way. And the fact, and you mentioned earlier, Jackie, that the attacks that supposedly the United States has just committed against Iran opens the door for quote-unquote cyber warfare against us, and I beg to differ. I don't think that had anything to do with it. That door has been wide open for a long, long time already, and this has already been going on for a long, long time, and this is just one incident that became known to the public.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for that point. But David, you said that first of all, maybe we should talk about how computer worms are different from computer viruses. And we're talking about, as Tony did mention, attacks against infrastructure really differing from attacks on computers.
They are, and Tony's absolutely right. I mean, the United States is the most vulnerable country around. Think of, what is it that we don't rely on computers for, right? Mm-hmm. So their air traffic control system, our phone system, our cell phone system, our nuclear power plants. We could spend the rest of the show making a list. And some of them are more vulnerable than others. And I think the Obama administration's been working pretty hard to try to seal that up. And they've also even been trying to make efforts within Congress to get legislation passed that would allow them to basically have a greater degree of federal control over the protection of critical infrastructure that's still in private hands, to make sure that those, somebody can't turn out the lights in L.A. or Boston or something like that. That said, when you're that vulnerable, it then raises the natural question, you're never going to keep a program like Olympic Games secret forever. You may keep it secret for a while, but does it then increase your vulnerability when it inevitably does become clear that the United States does offense as well as defense?
Let's move into the implications of that, because I'm wondering where the red lines are and whether or not the White House and Pentagon have thought about that, or are they making it up as they go along? Would we, for example, attack a banking system or a hospital? How far do you go?
Well, great question. So President Obama, in the course of the discussions over the Iranian program, raised this issue very frequently and appeared to try to make sure that the worms were designed very specifically at the Natanz plan and that it wouldn't take out the electrical system nearby or the hospitals nearby and have that kind of collateral damage. Now, other countries, other hackers, maybe a mob group, maybe a bunch of teenagers, they may not be operating under the same rules. And so one of the big issues is, do you want to have a treaty? Do you want to have some sets of rules so that people understand what's acceptable or not? Well, that's more difficult in this case because a lot of those who possess or create cyber weapons are not states, and so they don't sign treaties. Mm-hmm. You know, back in the nuclear age, you know, it was us, it was the Soviets, eventually it was the Chinese, you know, and then Britain and France and so forth. But you had a fairly small universe of the number of people in possession of the weapon. Not the case in cyber.
Let's take a call here from Faraz, who's calling from Melbourne, Florida. Welcome to On Point. Faraz.
Hi, Jackie. I just want to know, I'm from Pakistan, so I have a lot of family there, and I want to focus on the drone strikes just for a second here. So obviously yesterday we heard about we got Al-Qaeda's number 2, and, you know, obviously, you know, we could see that drone strikes are effective in some cases, but, I mean, that it obviously comes with a big mess because prior to that, you know, we had civilians that were killed in a wedding and things like that, and this is becoming more of a big discussion in the mosques, in the coffee houses, in the restaurants. In Pakistan, people obviously see some benefit of it, but the consequences are even worse. So my question is, what happens, God forbid, that someone, you know, does that here in America? I mean, it already happened with one person.
Uses a drone or something like that, you're saying?
Exactly. I mean, you know, because, I mean, I know that they were saying that, you know, a lot of hobbyists or even, you know, maybe a simple electrical engineer somewhere can probably come up with something. It doesn't have to be as big and as effective, but what if it even does damage on a small level, maybe kills one person or maybe releases some sort of chemical? I mean, are we ready to deal with the same consequences that come when someone else uses a drone on us?
Thank you for that.
I mean?
Yes, thank you for that. David, certainly a legitimate question from someone who has family in Pakistan where there has been a lot of anger over U.S. use of drones. But you mentioned trying to survey this, whether they would have cyber attack stuff or drones. It would be unlikely, wouldn't it, that could Al-Qaeda get its hands on a drone?
You know, they might be able to get one eventually, but, you know, a state might get one earlier than that. You know, a drug cartel might get a hold of one from Mexico and fly it over the border. I mean, sooner or later, monopolies end on weapon systems. You know, the Soviets got the bomb eventually, and then a lot of states that you wouldn't have guessed in 1949 would get them, got them. And North Korea has now. So in the case of cyber weapons, we already know that the Chinese, the Russians are quite advanced. Many other countries have them as well. Not clear whether they can do attacks on infrastructure of the kind we've just been discussing with Iran, but certainly there are repeated attacks in the United States each and every day, each and every hour, to scoop up large amounts of data, maybe to try to take over, you know, certain kinds of computers. So there's an active offense and defense operation underway here and has been for a while. The U.S. has always been willing to talk about the risks and the need for defense. It has never before, it's never acknowledged, even after all we've discussed, employing offensive weapons.
This is On Point. I'm Jackie Leiden, in for Tom Ashbrook. We're talking about the secret fronts of American wars in cyberspace and elsewhere. You can join the conversation. Have you been there, behind the controls of a drone, on patrol in Afghanistan or Iraq? Is cyber war preferable to real war? And with me today is New York Times chief Washington correspondent David Sanger, author of a new book on the White House, At War. David, we're going to play another clip here. On Tuesday, speaking on the Senate floor in Washington, Arizona Republican Senator John McCain accused the White House of leaking for political reasons and endangering ongoing operations in the process.
They cite leaked, classified, or highly sensitive information in what appears to be a broader administration effort to paint a portrait of the President of the United States as a strong leader on national security issues.
We have a call on that subject. Let's go to Steve, who's calling from Florence, South Carolina. Welcome to On Point, Steve.
Hi, Jackie.